Father Augustine Dinoia, entitled Living the Gospel of Life, a Challenge to American Catholics. This talk was given during the pro-life conference In God's Image, called To Build a Culture of Life, which was held at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law in Washington, D.C.
This mystery that God brings from nothing what he loves, both in creation and in the incarnation and in the order of grace, this mystery has seemed to some people to be the suppression, obliteration of the human. See, in other words, somehow, if you think in these terms, then the human is nothing and God is all, and in order for the human being to be something, God must be erased. See? This was the sort of the conclusion of modernity. I'm moving to B here. The autonomous self can only survive if God is eclipsed. See, because people thought of God and us in competition. See? In other words, the creation from nothing meant that we are nothing and God is all, and then the human is, you might say, disappears unless it can reclaim from God the territory which he occupies. So you see, it's a competition rather than the very condition for our existence and all that we do. This is the great message of Evangelium Vitae, this incredible cultural analysis. Now, as I sometimes say, did the Pope need 100 pages to tell us that killing is wrong? Right? We already knew this from the commandments. See, in effect, you could say the substance of that encyclical could have been summarized in 5 pages. In fact, you could take the 5 pages where the key dogmatic statements are made and just publish those. Why all of this other stuff? Because this is a profound analysis of the state we're in. See, because what the Pope is essentially saying, absolutely directly contrary to what modernity has taught us, the eclipse of God creates the greatest peril for the human. You see? The culture of death is born out of the attempt to erase God. When human beings stop thinking of life as a gift from God, but you might say their own gift to themselves, then they are in the greatest danger. And the Pope says the 20th century proves this in spades. In spades. See? Now this is very, very, very important. Because the argument we're having with the culture, if you might want to call it an argument, is an argument precisely about the analysis, about this analysis, and whether or not it's correct. See? And so it's not autonomy that we want, but as the Pope teaches actually in Veritatis Splendor, theonomy. See? It's not a question of either we're on our own or we're subject to another, heteronomy. No, it's to be subject to God is to be to realize most fully the human, not to obliterate it. Now, if I may refer to something that helps to throw a great deal of light on this. Today's gospel, by the way, for those of you who either have been to Mass or will be, is a parable about the wicked husbandman. It throws light on this. But let me backtrack. When Aquinas teaches the doctrine of the angels, and he comes to the question, how could the angels have sinned? What was the nature of their sin? You may say, how did I get to the angels? Bear with me. We have to reclaim the angels from the New Age. When he says, what was the nature of angelic sin? He eliminates all the obvious contenders. I mean, without a body, you can't sin by lust, see, or gluttony. So he eliminates them. And so he comes, finally, to the traditional explanation for their sin, which is pride. And he says, it is said that the sin of the angels was that they wanted to be like God. Now get this. If you don't get goosebumps, you're asleep. Aquinas says, what's wrong with that? See, what's wrong with wanting to be like God? He says, isn't that the whole point? See? And he says the problem with the angels who sinned was that they wanted to be like God as due them, as it was their due. See? Now, this is very interesting. In other words, the fallen angels wanted to take from God what could only be given to them as a gift. Now, today, the gospel is about the wicked husbandman. That's the parable where the owner, he's an absentee landlord. He sends his agents. They kill them, beat them up. He says, I'll send my son. They'll treat him well. They think if there's no heir, this was kind of the law, if there's no heir, we inherit. So they killed him. They killed the son. Okay? And so in effect, you see what the Pope is saying to us here is that unless we understand that life is a gift that we cannot take. Now that means life at all three levels of it, if I may speak of this: creation, incarnation, and grace. Not to mention glory. But see, all of those things that God wants to give us as a gift, we must receive as a gift. And if we do not live with the realization that they are a gift, we will be colluders, or at least very tempted by the culture of death. So here I conclude by saying God is the greatest friend of the human then. See, the doctrine of Evangelium Vitae, and therefore of the gospel of life, is a doctrine about the love of God for human life, and therefore the necessity of our own necessity of being the proclaimers of that gospel. See, and this is the deepest, in my view, theological root, foundation for participation in this movement. This is the deepest reason, because it touches on the deepest truth about God and us, which is that life is a gift, and that without God we are nothing, but with God we are everything. And the eclipse of God is not of benefit to the human race, but its greatest peril. Okay? And this is why the battle is really worth fighting, and why, contrary to what our critics say, it must be fought not simply in churches, but in the public realm itself. The Veritatis Splendor was signed on the Feast of the Transfiguration in 1993. Now, the Feast of the Transfiguration is very interesting, because the Feast of the Transfiguration essentially is about the transformation of the human in the image of Christ. Now, remember, what happens at the Transfiguration is the disciples see Christ transfigured. They see him gloriously presented to them. The veil is parted. It's not that he has become something he is not, but they see his glory for a moment. Then the veil closes again. And St. Leo the Great, who preached on this once, said that he thought there were two reasons why Christ allowed himself to be seen by his disciples transfigured. The first was, to quote Leo, to remove the scandal of the cross. Surely, when the disciples saw Christ on the cross, they would see it as a defeat. Leo says, only because they saw him transfigured did they know, as we might put it, appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, this was not a defeat but a victory. But Leo says, and this is closer to home, that the other reason, the second reason for the Transfiguration, was so that we, the Church, might see what was to become of her. As St. Paul says, and surely thinking of the Transfiguration, in a passage very early on in 2 Corinthians, we are being transformed, changed from one degree of glory to another. So, again, appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, God knows, because we all feel as if we're slipping into decrepitude. The idea that we're moving towards glory is a little bit hard to buy into. And here, that's why it requires faith to see this. And in fact, we will not see the glory revealed until the end. But you see, what does this, now let's pause a moment, what does this mean, this transformation that is going to be a conformation to Christ and therefore the revelation of the true glory that is hidden within us? What does this all mean? Well, what it means is, I think, can only be understood if we look at another gospel passage, and that is of the disciples with Christ at Caesarea Philippi, when he asks them, "Who do men say that I am?" And they say, they give their list of things, and then he says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are Christ, the Son of the Most High." Now, in that passage, that's a long passage, I cannot review all of the interesting parts to it, but in there, towards the end, Christ says, "Now, I'm going to have to go to Jerusalem and suffer." And then he says at the end, "And you will too. You must, in order to be a disciple of mine, you must be willing to carry your cross and follow me." And that's where there is that most strange, paradoxical expression. He says, "Unless you lose your life for my sake, you will not find it. If you lose your life for my sake, you will find it." Now here, I think, if we may cut quickly to the chase, what I think our Lord is saying is something like this. He's saying, unless you become like me, you will not find your true self. Now, you will see how awesome, astonishing that is if you compare it to yourself. Think of yourself as a parent, a teacher, a bishop, priest, preacher. What one of us would ever say to anyone in our charge, no matter how high an opinion we have of ourselves, "You will never find your true self unless you become like me." Now, we all think that in most cases they would do very much better than they're doing. See? But we want them to be themselves, independent. You see? We want them to realize what it is that their gifts are. We don't want them to be clones of us. So immediately we see that only the inexhaustibly rich, infinitely rich Son of God could say to the human race, "You will find your true self only by becoming like me." He's saying that an indefinite number of persons, all who have lived, who live now, and who will live in the future, will only find their true self by being conformed to him. And the more they try to be themselves without him, the less they will be themselves. You see? Now, this means, you see, that Christ is not, the following of Christ for the individual is not the suppression of the human, which is what most people think it is, right? If you become a Christian, then there's no more fun, right? I mean, this is the way people essentially talk about sexual morality. It's a burden, see? If you're not a Christian, if you don't carry all of that freight with you, you'll be much happier. But see, and this is exactly where we have to counter, and where Veritatis Splendor is essentially leading us, as I will try to point out in a moment. To be human is not to be something independently of Christ, but to be continually more and more like him. And only in that way will we become more and more uniquely, distinctively ourselves. One of the reasons why our Holy Father always refers to this, Christ knows what is in man. Christ is the secret of the human, not the enemy of it. See? And this is also true of society. So Christianity is not a sect. We have to resist this. Christianity is not a little sect, a little religious, funny little group of religious people who have peculiar notions, none of which can be supported by anything rational. No, Christianity is God. The Christendom, or you might say the church, is the human race in its eschatological completion. And so that it is not just individuals that are being transformed into Christ's image, but the whole society itself that is being transformed in, you might say, to the extended family of the Blessed Trinity. And there's no other future. There is no other future for the world than this one that God has ordained. See? Now, that means that to be free, is not to be before 10,000 possible choices, including sin. To be free is to be able to choose God. God, as I have here, this is one of the deep messages of Veritatis Splendor. Authentic freedom is the God-given capacity to choose happiness. Because God is not interested in compelling. What point is there in compelling love? It doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. So the desire of God is to bring us to embrace him freely. And freedom is the gift God gives for this purpose. And the tragedy and the drama and the comedy, too, of human existence is that unlike anything else in the universe, all sub-rational creatures, we are the only creatures that could fail to choose the good. That's why truth and freedom are connected, you see? That you must recognize the truth of what human beings are in order to recognize that freedom is the embracing of that truth and the direction, the finality towards which it leads us, which is happiness in God and happiness with the Blessed Trinity. Now, this has a huge impact on what we think about our responsibilities in the wider society and our responsibilities to each other, and why we cannot simply agree to embrace that kind of undifferentiated freedom, as sometimes the Pope calls undifferentiated pluralism, in which no definition of the human has any authority. All are simply self-creations. See? Everybody more or less defines what the human is for himself or herself. Fides et ratio. This encyclical was signed on the Feast of the Triumph of the Cross. An interesting thing, isn't it? The greatest paradox of all history, that which so confounds human reason, should be the time, the moment that the Pope chooses to celebrate the signing of Fides et Ratio, where what we are hoping to see is how faith and reason come into harmony with each other. You say to yourself, is the Pope missing something, you know? The triumph of the cross shows the unity of faith and reason. Why is this? Because, and this is also a deep point, bearing very much on the issues that we have to address, because reason by itself never reaches its completion. See, human reason by itself never finds all there is to find. Now, you know, here is again a huge effort on our part is needed in order to counter the view that it is just the opposite, that only unfettered reason finds the truth, and faith is a constraint on reason, right? Isn't that what everybody thinks? If you believe something, if you believe in God, then somehow your scope for free inquiry is limited. See? It's amazing how opposite the view that Christians ought to hold is generally held. See? So most people think that rather than being the liberation of human reason, faith is its greatest constraint. So academic freedom, this is a whole battle we're having about ex corde ecclesiae, as you all know. Human reason is most free when it is least beholden to any belief system, dare I say it, you know. But we're talking about something more than a belief system. We are talking about the personal engagement of human beings with the divine Trinity. See? So if God is the one who reveals himself to us, and God is all in all, then to believe in God cannot be the constraint, but must be the liberation of human reason. And only in the cross, you might say, paradoxically, does this become clear. Because only in the cross does the full depth of divine wisdom become, opens up to us. I think here especially of the writings of Edith Stein and her life, if you want to see a powerful expression of this truth. Now, however, there is a little irony, and I'm moving to B, granted the great significance of the encyclical's connection with the triumph of the cross and the liberating power of faith, what you have here is a tremendous irony in this encyclical. As I have said, at the end of the 19th century, the Pope had to defend faith against reason. At the end of the 20th, he has to defend reason against unreason. So now, in Fides et Ratio, we have a defense of the power of reason to find truth. I know, the Pope must have chuckled. He must have said to himself, this is really funny. This is funny. You see, because what the undifferentiated pluralism or relativism, which he has so clearly and wonderfully analyzed in these other documents, here is again exposed from another perspective as coming from the erosion of the confidence of philosophers and scientists and many other people. He's most concerned about this because it has affected the wider society. If it were just a matter of academics, you know how much influence they would have. But it's the penetration of this relativism into the wider society that concerns our Holy Father in Fides et Ratio. So now you have this remarkable fact, the remarkable witness of this encyclical is that faith must come out in support of the power of the human mind to reach the truth about many important matters. And that the reason that our Holy Father does this is precisely because faith does not float in a world that is, you might say, simply a world of commitment or emotion and affect. Christ calls us think about him too. Christ comes to challenge not only the human heart and affections, but the human mind. See? So that the human mind, therefore, rising to the highest level of its capacities, will inevitably serve the faith, not be its enemy. So the Pope is not afraid of human reason. On the contrary, he's encouraging us to use it in order to understand more deeply the things that we believe. And here, no, this is an important matter because, as I've said elsewhere, the greatest problem in religion is not skepticism, but credulity. In the name of religion, people appear to be willing to believe almost anything. And this is a big problem right now. See? And one of the points that our Holy Father is addressing is precisely this, that we cannot think of our faith as coming to set reason aside or to destroy it. On the contrary, it presupposes it, because it is the perfection, fulfillment of the human intellect, as we have seen over and over here. See, revelation does not come to set aside the human, but to bring it to its perfection, consummation. Otherwise, God would be at cross purposes with himself. God would have made something that he had to set aside in order to save it. And that is not Catholic faith. It may be some versions of Christianity, but it is not the Catholic faith. God does not have to set aside what he did first. He has to heal it, but he has to heal it by the blood of Christ and raising it up to the level where it belongs, not suppressing it. Now here we come, you might say, the rubber hits the road here, as far as living the gospel of faith is concerned. Because what the Pope is saying is the culture of death feeds on the erosion of the consensus about what moral truth is. This is what we have to persuade. I know it's not easy, but we have to persuade. We have to be like John Paul II. These long encyclicals, no. And 13 of them, right? Why? He is in dialogue with the whole modern world. He is trying to persuade. He's not just saying, do this because I'm the Pope and I said to do it. He's trying to persuade us of the truth here. And so he engages in argument, not just injunction. See, he doesn't just say, do this. If he had to just do that, there would be very few documents. I mean it. And I think there are a lot of people who wish there were fewer. They moan, the theologians, about all these documents. I think it's fun, but I mean to see them moaning, to be honest. Anyway, but you see the point here, that the heart, it seems to me the heart here is, the heart of this message is that unless we can persuade the wider public that living the gospel of life, and therefore opposing abortion, euthanasia, and all God knows what nightmares we are yet to face in these areas, right? Unless we think of human life, we recognize human life to be a gift from God over which we have no authority whatsoever. And that is from when it is given until the end. And in fact, of course, the end of life is a passage to another life. But life is, as God says, is mine, and I share it, I give it. And unless we can persuade the wider culture that this is not just a peculiar Catholic kind of knee-jerk reaction to the growing freedom that all of us want to enjoy in our culture, unless we can help them to see this, they will continue to reject what we proclaim as the gospel of life, and in that rejection, bring us closer and closer to a world in which only power and not truth will prevail. And that is the nightmare scenario, which is beyond all the reproductive and other technological nightmares which we can project for ourselves in the 21st century. Okay, that's it.